Well, good evening, everyone. I hope everybody's having a great Wednesday. I'm having a great Wednesday myself, and I am fixing to have a better Wednesday, as I often say, because we're going to be studying the Bible together. And I sure appreciate the fact that you are continuing to tune in and that you are continuing to study with me. We're going to continue now to look at the Sermon on the Mount, and that would be in Matthew 5, 6, and 7. If you've been with us on a regular basis, you know that we have finished chapter 5 in our last study together, and so we are beginning chapter 6. So, if you've got your Bibles, that's where you want to be. But as we set the stage for Matthew chapter 6, let me remind you just one more time about where we're at in terms of structure and the flow of the Sermon on the Mount. It started, of course, with the Beatitudes, the first 12 verses of Matthew chapter 5. We looked at that way back in April. And then beginning in June, we turned our attention to the rest of the Sermon on the Mount. We began, of course, in verse 13, where we are told that God expects us as kingdom subjects to be salt and light. That means we are to be conspicuously different than our surroundings and our attitudes, our motives, our behaviors. And then he says in verse 20, our righteousness has to exceed, it has to far surpass the model of righteousness that was demonstrated and embraced by the Pharisees. And we talked about the model of Pharisaical righteousness. Pharisees, in terms of their righteousness, in terms of their response to God's Word, they were only concerned about externals. They really didn't care much about the attitude. They didn't care much about the heart. They figured if they got the externals right, everything else was fine. They were also partial in terms of their righteous response. What I mean by that is when it came to obeying God's will, they were selective, partial. They didn't embrace all of it. Things that they didn't want to embrace, they found a way not to embrace it. Things that they thought was, okay, I can handle that, they've embraced it. Partial obedience. So we have a focus on externals. We have a focus on just partial obedience. And we also have a focus on self-centeredness. It's really all about them. That's really going to come into focus as we start into chapter 6. But after Jesus said in verse 20 of chapter 5 that our righteousness has to exceed that of the Pharisees, he then gave 6 illustrations of what he's talking about. And he talked about it in terms of murder. He talked about it in terms of adultery. He talked about it in terms of divorce. He talked about it in terms of oaths and vows. He talked about it in terms of how we relate to people who insult us or people who humiliate us, or how we respond to people that have a legitimate claim against us that we have injured in some way. He talked about it in terms of how we need to have the best interest of everyone, even our antagonists at heart. All of those things from verse 21 all the way through verse 48 or the rest of chapter 5. And now that brings us to chapter 6. Let's take a look at chapter 6. Jesus really is continuing his discussion of what greater righteousness is, but he's moving on from these 6 illustrations of what it is supposed to look like. And we're not going to read the first 18 verses. That's simply too long to read, so we're not going to read that at one shot. But we're going to look at this, and we're going to see the focus here in chapter 6, verses 1 through 18, what it is really all about. It is all about attitude. Everything in chapter 6, verses 1 through 18, is an emphasis on attitude. God is saying, Christ is saying, who is God in the flesh, He is saying, subjects of the King, if we are going to accept Jesus' invitation to be a part of His kingdom, attitude matters. Our motives and our attitudes matter. It goes back to what I was saying a minute ago about that Pharisaical model of righteousness that was only external, that was partial, and it was self-centered. Well, the emphasis here is going to be on a self-centered form of righteousness that the Pharisees have, and how we have to have a very different approach as we seek to honor and serve God. Now, what he does here in verses 1 through 18 is he selects 3 examples of religious observances to make his point that motive is crucial, that our attitude or our motive is crucial in what we do as we seek to honor God. Now, those 3 religious observances that he is going to select here, he is going to talk about giving to the poor, then he's going to talk about praying, and then he's going to talk about fasting. And these 3 religious practices, giving alms, benevolence, praying, and fasting, these 3 observances were and still are the most prominent practical requirements for personal piety in mainstream Judaism. If you're a good Jew, these 3 activities are central in your life. They essentially are the marks of authentic piety. If you're going to be a good Jew, almsgiving, praying, and fasting are the most prominent requirements that there are. Hey, remember in Luke chapter 18? You'll see the emphasis here in Luke chapter 18 when Jesus tells the parable of the Pharisee and the tax collector who went up to the temple to pray. Take a look at it real quick. Pharisee and the tax collector, or the Pharisee and the publican. The Pharisee in verse 11 stood and was praying this to himself, God, I thank you that I am not like other people, swindlers, unjust, adulterers, or even like this tax collector. I fast twice a week. See, fasting. It was so important to Jewish piety. I pay tithes of all that I get. And the idea here, of course, is in the paying tithes, part of that is all about this giving to the poor. That's a part of the whole tithe. So you can see the emphasis here on these particular practices. And of course, it says in verse 10, 2 men went up to the temple to pray, one a Pharisee and a tax collector. So he went up to pray, and he talks about his giving, and he talks about his fasting. Prayer and giving and fasting. Those were the marks of piety. And then, of course, take a look at the book of Acts. Acts chapter 10. Acts chapter 10. This is Cornelius. The conversion of Cornelius, of course, when the gospel first goes to the Gentiles, and here is, of course, the first Gentile convert. You look with me at verses 1 or 2. Now there was a man in Caesarea named Cornelius, a centurion of what was called the Italian cohort, a devout man and one who feared God with all of his household and gave many alms to the Jewish people and prayed to God continually. So you see this emphasis here on prayers and almsgiving. And he's not a Jew, but he was a God-fearer. He respected the God of the Jews. He acknowledged that the God of the Jews was the one true God, and he sought to honor him, and he modeled his piety after the Jews, and that involved a structured prayer life, and it involved almsgiving. And then if you go down at verse 3 of chapter 10, and about the 9th hour of the day, he clearly saw in a vision an angel of God who had come in and said to him, Cornelius, and fixing his gaze on him and being much alarmed, he said, what is it, Lord? And he said to him, your prayers and alms have ascended as a memorial before God. Your prayers and your alms. And so that's why I say, when we think about Jewish practices and we think about Jewish piety, these 3 practices were central in the life of the good Jew. And so as we look at Matthew chapter 6 then, verses 1 through 18, it doesn't surprise us that Jesus talks about almsgiving and praying and fasting. Okay, so what's Jesus saying essentially here? Well, before we mention that, let's just read the first part. Like I said, we're not going to read all 18 verses in one shot, but let's read the first few verses. Beware of practicing your righteousness before men to be noticed by them. Otherwise, you have no reward with your Father who is in heaven. So when you give to the poor, do not sound a trumpet before you, as the hypocrites do in the synagogues and in the streets, so that they may be honored by men. Truly I say to you, they have their reward in full. But when you give to the poor, do not let your left hand know what your right hand is doing, so that your giving will be in secret. And your Father who sees what is done in secret will reward you. I'll tell you what, let's read verse 5 and 6, shall we? Let's just keep on. When you pray, you are not to be like the hypocrites, for they love to stand and pray in the synagogues and on the street corners, so that they may be seen by men. Truly I say to you, they have their reward in full. But when you pray, go into your inner room, close your door, and pray to your Father who is in secret, and your Father who sees what is done in secret will reward you. Okay. I'll tell you what, let's jump over now. We will skip verses 7 through 15. Now let's verse 16 for continuity here. Whenever you fast. Okay, so he started with when you give alms to the poor, verse 2. Then in verse 5, when you pray. And now in verse 16, when you fast. Whenever you fast, do not put on a gloomy face as the hypocrites do, for they neglect their appearance so that they will be noticed by men when they are fasting. Truly I say to you, they have their reward in full. Okay, so what's this all about? Well, like I said, this is all about our attitude, and this is all about our motives. And what Jesus is doing in these first 18 verses, it is a call for us to check our motives. It is a call for us to check our attitudes. Basically what these things are, these practices are, whenever we give to someone who is hurting or to a cause, or we pray, or we fast. Whenever we're doing any of those things, it ought to be an expression of a heart that is totally focused on God. That's the purpose of those things. Those are expressions of a heart that is totally focused on God. They are not to be religious gimmicks that are designed to draw attention to ourselves, designed to produce accolades for ourselves. The fact of the matter is, everybody, most everybody, I will make allowances that there may be some exceptions, but there are very few exceptions. And even those who look to be exceptions to the rule, they will all tell you that no, they struggle with the same temptations. What I'm talking about here is there is no denying. When we think about this, there's no denying that God's people, this is why this is so prominent in the Sermon on the Mount. Remember, this is all about life in the kingdom. There is no denying that disciples have always struggled and will always continue to struggle with wanting man's approval. Listen, we all like to have people's approval. We all like that. We all like to be patted on the back. I believe we all like to be recognized. We all like to be applauded. We all do to some extent. And so there is always going to be this struggle, and it's to that struggle, that continuous, ongoing struggle, that Jesus is speaking. As we always have this place in our hearts most all of us have this place in our hearts that wants to win the approval of people, we ought to be fighting hard against those sinful desires. Our ultimate desire should always be to have God's approval. That should be our consuming focus. Is God pleased? Do I have God's approval? Regardless of what any man thinks of me, regardless of what any person thinks of me, does God find pleasure in me? Does God approve of me? That needs to be our overwhelming, consuming focus. That's the point here of verses 1 through 18. As I said, it is a call for all of us to constantly be checking our motive and checking our attitude. And what Jesus is telling us here is that we can even use righteous living. We can use things that are good, like righteous living, like giving to the poor, like praying, like fasting. We can even use those things to stroke our egos. And a lot of people were using those things to stroke their egos in Jesus' day. But what Jesus is essentially saying in all of this and in these 18 verses is that all of these things, righteous living, fasting and prayer and giving to the poor, ought to be motivated by a genuine desire to commune with God and please Him. Why am I giving? Why am I praying? Why do I fast? Why? It is a call for us to kind of pause and really check our motives, look deep down in our heart and ask those tough questions. Have you asked yourself those tough questions lately? You know, I got to be honest with you. It's been a while. This is, again, challenging me to once again pause and seriously look deeply into my heart and ask these questions. That's why, we can live a lifetime and never exhaust the information in these 27 books of the New Testament or 66 books of the entire Bible. We can't exhaust it. We can read it all. We could read the entire Bible in a setting if we really wanted to. It would take a long time. It'd take several hours, but we can do it. Listen, if you just, read a few chapters a day, if you read 10 chapters a day, you'd easily read the New Testament in a month. And yet when you finish, you don't just go, well, I'm done. I've read that book. I got books all over my shelf where I go, yeah, I've read that. Hey, I actually read that book twice. But I don't have any book I've read 3 times. There's no reason for me to do that. Now, some of you may have. You have your favorite novel or something that you may have read repeatedly. But you know what I'm talking about. The Bible is different. Because we constantly need to be challenging. This is God is talking to us personally. And He is helping develop us. And that development is an ongoing, continual life experience until Jesus comes back. And so we need to constantly be looking into our hearts and asking ourselves, why do I pray? What is my purpose in prayer? If you practice fasting, and some of you do, why do I do that? Why do I give? Why do I do that? Well, the answer that God wants from us is that we do those things because we genuinely want to commune with Him. It has nothing to do about stroking our ego. It has nothing to do about others seeing us and patting us on the back and praising us and applauding us for how holy we are. It is simply all about we really want to commune with God and we want to please Him. That's what it should be all about. It is a reminder, these first 18 verses are a reminder that we can have a very active faith life and still have ourselves at the center of it. Now that's scary, isn't it? We can have a vibrant, active faith life and we can still Be at the very center of that. You know what it's called when that happens, when we have a very active faith life, but we're at the center of it. It's not that we really genuinely want to commune with God and please Him, but we're looking for the approval and of people, and we enjoy the benefits that come with it in our relationships with people. What Jesus calls a person who has that, is pursuing an active faith life for those reasons. He calls them, I bet you know what He calls them, because in each of these three sections He uses the word. Look in verse 2 when He says, when you give to the poor, don't sound a trumpet as the hypocrites. He calls them hypocrites. And then when you pray, look at verse 5, you're not to be like the hypocrites. There it is again. And then in verse 16, whenever you fast, do not put on a gloomy face as the hypocrites do. Now, you've heard me talk about the word hypocrites before, but let me remind you of what that word meant in Jesus' time. Now, for us, it's a really bad word. Anybody who is a hypocrite, no one is ever complimenting anyone when they say, he's a great hypocrite. That is always used in a pejorative way. It is always used to say this person lacks character. He's not authentic. He's not genuine. He's not real at all. He's a faker. There is not a context where we use this word in a neutral way or even a complimentary way. Well, it wasn't that way in Jesus' day. Now, He's not using it complimentary here, and He's not using it neutral here. He obviously is using it in a bad way. But the word itself was very much of a neutral word that was frequently used in Jesus' day. It is a word that came from the world of Greek theater. And we use the word actor. Actor's not a bad word. What's he do for a living? Oh, he's an actor. Hey, who's your favorite actor? That wasn't the word they used back in the day of Greek theater. They would go, hey, who's your favorite hypocrite? Hypocrite was just a stage actor. It was someone who played a part. Now you can see where we get the word from and how Jesus uses that word here. An actor who's playing a part, that's not really him. Actors will tell you about how people who watch them on camera, on TV, or the big screen, or on stage, they fall in love with the person that they're playing. But then when they get to know them, they're nothing like what they were seeing on TV. Well, yeah, they're nothing like that. They were playing a part on television. They were playing a role in that movie. They were just one of the characters in that play. But that's not who they were. They were acting. Well, that's what this word means. And so Jesus says, all of these people here that He's warning us not to be like, who give alms and pray and fast, He said a lot of those people are just acting. They're just acting. From the outside, they look so authentic. He said, but in reality, they're not, because their goal isn't to commune with God. Their goal is to receive accolades for themselves, to be admired by people. And that's why not only does He use this word hypocrite 3 times in giving, in praying, and in fasting, but He also says in all 3 of those instances that people who do this, look at the end of verse 2. Truly I say to you, they have their reward in full. Look at verse 5, the end of it. They have their reward in full. Look at the end of verse 16. They have their reward in full. Well, what are they going to get for their approach to faith? What are they going to get for their active faith life? Well, they're going to get the accolades of people. They're going to get what they want, and that is it. That is their payment in full. That's what they're after. That's what they're going to get. They'll get people patting them on the back. They'll get people bragging on them about their righteousness. They will, receive praise and honor and status for, how devoted they are. But that's it. That's it. Nothing more, because they're just playing a part. They're not doing those things because they genuinely want to commune with God and they want to please Him. They're going to get what they want. But that is it. Well, is it possible that they'll also get that? They are, after all, they do have an active faith life. Is God not pleased at all? Not at all. They have the reward in full. There is nothing else beyond that. God is not going to reward them. God is not going to honor them. God is not pleased with them. That's why we said at the outset of this study here in verses 1 through 18 of chapter 6, it's all about attitudes and motives. An active faith life of praying, almsgiving, fasting. And again, Jesus selects those because those were kind of the three central practices that defined Jewish piety. If the motive driving those things is not to commune with God and really please Him, then God's not interested in it. That is the essence of what Jesus is saying here. I love some of these images that He's using here, like verse 2, when you give to the poor, don't sound a trumpet before you, as the hypocrites do in the synagogues and the streets. Now, did some of the Pharisees and people really do that? They see somebody poor and they're about to give them, drop a few coins in their cup, and do they pull out the trumpet and then give a long blast on it to make sure everybody stops and stares in their way, and when everybody's staring, then they'll take out their coins and drop them in the cup? Did people actually do that? Oh, well, I doubt it. There aren't any actual cases where that is seen in literature. So Jesus is probably using it as a metaphor for calling attention to oneself. You don't have to blow a trumpet to call attention to yourself. There are other, a little bit more discreet ways to call attention to yourself, but nevertheless, call attention to yourself. And so Jesus is probably using it that. But that's a great image. The emphasis is on, again, all about oneself. Look, don't call attention to yourself. And then, of course, he talks about standing on the street corner to pray. Look at it in verse 5. When you pray, you're not to be like the hypocrites, for they love to stand and pray in the synagogues and on the street corners so that they can be seen in men. Prayer was not normally practiced on street corners, but those who really strictly observed the times for prayer could actually deliberately time their movements so that they could be in a very crowded space just at the right time when it's prayer time. I remember flying to Amman, Jordan years ago, way back in 92 in my first trip to Israel, almost 30 years ago. Holy cow! I can't believe it's been that long. So anyway, I was on an Arab airline, Royal Jordanian Airlines. So most of the people, overwhelmingly, were Arabs, were Jordanian citizens. And there were a few, and of course that means most of them were Muslim. And so there were a few, the most pious among them. When it was time to pray, Islam has, very set times to pray. And they would get up. And they would determine the direction of Mecca, and they would take their prayer rug and they would put it out in the middle of the floor, and everyone would see them. I'm always reminded of that when I read about this standing on the street corner. How people could time things so that they would deliberately, bring themselves into a very public place during the time of prayer. And so again, the idea of calling attention to yourself. And then of course there in chapter 16, he talks about those who fast and he talks about don't be like those who put on a gloomy face and they just make their appearance disheveled because they want people to go, hey, are you okay? Are you okay? What's wrong? Oh, I've been fasting. Oh, wow. I've tried that before. Wow, maybe someday I can be like you. Hey, did you see Dan's was fasting, man. Can you believe that? Wow, I wish I had the dedication that he had. Hey, look everybody. Dan, he is really, man, he and God are obviously, he's my spiritual hero. I wish I could be like him. That's the idea here. And so Jesus uses all these images, blowing trumpets before you give, making sure you end up on a busy street corner before you pray, making yourself look so disheveled and just tortured from your period of fasting to the glory of God, to say, no, God's not interested in any of that. And if your faith life is like that, then you are at the center of it. And if you're at the center of it, then your payment is in full down here. You will never have God's approval at all. Okay, well, we're going to close there. Listen, I think we're going to come back to this section, though, maybe one more time. We're going to take a look, because of all these three practices, interestingly enough, Jesus only expands on one of them, and that is prayer. He actually gives a mini lesson on prayer. Now, we're not going to spend time really unpacking this carefully, because it wasn't too long ago, actually, that on Sunday morning we did a series on prayer. I hope you remember that. And we did a series on prayer, and we looked at some of these principles here. And so we've recently unpacked this, but I do want to kind of summarize these things again. I think we all could benefit from that. And so next time we come back together, we'll stay here in the first 18 verses. But when we do that, we will focus on what Jesus has to say on prayer. Thanks for joining me again. I enjoyed it. I sure got something out of it, and I hope that you did too. God bless. Take care. Lord willing, I'll see you very soon.